Imagine waking up tomorrow and making a quiet decision. Not a dramatic vow, not a public challenge, just a simple internal switch. Today, I stop eating sugar. No pastries with coffee, no juice, just this once. No late night dessert to calm your thoughts. For the first few hours, nothing seems different. You feel fine, focused, maybe even proud of yourself. And then, without warning, something shifts. Your attention starts drifting. Your thoughts circle. Not toward food in general, but toward sweetness specifically. Images appear uninvited, familiar, comforting, almost emotional. And that's when most people realize something unsettling. Quitting sugar doesn't feel like removing a food. It feels like losing a presence. That reaction is not weakness. It's biology. Most people believe quitting sugar is a dietary decision, a matter of discipline, calories, or taste preferences. But physiologically, it's something else entirely. It's a neurological disruption. Because sugar is not just fuel, it's a signal. And for years, your brain has been built around that signal. Every time sugar enters your bloodstream, your brain responds in a very specific way. Deep inside, in a region called the nucleus accumbens, your primary reward center, dopamine, is released. Dopamine is not pleasure itself. It's anticipation, motivation, the chemical that tells your brain, this matters, remember this. Over time, repeated sugar intake strengthens neural pathways connected to reward, comfort, and relief. These pathways don't operate consciously, they fire automatically. That's why sugar cravings don't feel like hunger. They feel urgent, emotional, personal. So when you remove sugar, your brain doesn't interpret it as a neutral change. It interprets it as a loss. Within the first 24 hours, dopamine activity begins to drop. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. You may notice restlessness, mild anxiety, a sense of emptiness that doesn't match your physical state. Your stomach may be full, your body may have energy, but your mind feels unsettled. This is the first critical distinction most people miss. The initial struggle of quitting sugar is not metabolic, it's neurological. Your brain has learned to rely on fast dopamine spikes from sugar to regulate mood, attention, and even stress. When those spikes disappear, the brain doesn't calmly adapt. It resists, it searches, it signals discomfort. This is why sugar withdrawal often feels confusing. People say, "I'm not hungry, but something feels off." That off is the brain recalibrating its reward system. Scientifically, sugar activates the same reward circuitry as nicotine and other addictive substances. Not because sugar is evil, but because the brain cannot distinguish between natural and artificial reward intensity. Dopamine responds to magnitude, not morality. As sugar intake continues over years, tolerance develops. The same amount of sugar produces less dopamine response. So the brain asks for more frequency, more intensity, more sweetness. This is not a failure of willpower. It's adaptation. And sugar's danger lies in its invisibility. Unlike drugs or alcohol, it doesn't announce itself. It's normalized, socially reinforced, hidden in foods labeled healthy. Your brain doesn't evaluate context, it responds chemically every time. So when you quit sugar, you're not just resisting temptation, you're dismantling a deeply conditioned neurological loop. By the second and third day, the brain's resistance intensifies. Energy feels inconsistent. Focus wavers. Irritability rises. Not because the body is malfunctioning, but because the brain is deprived of a shortcut it relied on. At this stage, many people believe something is wrong with them. They assume their body needs sugar. But biologically, the body is remarkably stable. Blood glucose is regulated, energy is available. What's struggling is the brain's reward expectation. Neuroscientists describe this phase as neurochemical adaptation. Dopamine receptors, previously overstimulated, begin downregulating. The brain temporarily produces less dopamine overall while recalibrating sensitivity. This creates a paradoxical state. You feel less motivated precisely because your brain is learning to restore balance. If you push through this window, something important begins to happen. Dopamine production slowly resumes not from sugar, but from intrinsic sources. Sleep quality starts to matter more. Movement feels rewarding again. Completing tasks produces satisfaction instead of stress. This is not detox mythology. It's neuroplasticity in action. The brain is not collapsing, it's reorganizing. And this reorganization is the foundation of everything that follows in the next 30 days. By day 4, something subtle but important begins to change. The panic eases, but clarity does not arrive yet. This is the phase most people misunderstand. You're no longer in acute withdrawal, but you don't feel better either. The sharp cravings soften, yet a dull heaviness replaces them. Motivation feels muted. Emotions feel flatter. Not painful, just strangely quiet. Many people describe it as feeling disconnected or indifferent, as if something that used to color their day has faded. This is not depression. It's neurological recalibration. For years, sugar provided exaggerated dopamine signals, artificial highs that trained your brain to expect frequent stimulation. When those signals disappear, the brain does not immediately restore balance. Instead, it lowers overall dopamine output while it resensitizes receptors. Think of it as turning down the volume so the speakers can recover. During this period, your brain is learning how to feel reward again without chemical exaggeration. This is why people often say, nothing feels exciting anymore. Not because life became dull, but because the brain is relearning baseline. At the same time, a deeper system quietly enters the process, the gut-brain axis. Sugar doesn't just feed you, it feeds specific bacteria in your gut microbes that thrive on simple carbohydrates. When sugar intake stops, those bacteria begin to die off. And when they do, they don't go quietly. As the microbiome shifts, inflammatory signals temporarily increase. Neurotransmitter production fluctuates. Remember, over 90% of serotonin, the chemical linked to mood stability, is produced in the gut. So, when gut balance is disrupted, mood follows. This explains why days 5 through 7 can feel emotionally unpredictable. One moment calm, the next moment irritable or unmotivated. This is not a failure of progress. It is evidence of adaptation. Meanwhile, metabolically, the body is stabilizing faster than the mind. Blood glucose variability decreases, insulin signaling improves, energy supply becomes steadier, but the brain, which has been conditioned to quick spikes, lags behind. It takes time for neural expectations to catch up with metabolic reality. By the end of the first week, many people notice something unexpected: fewer energy crashes. Afternoons feel less foggy. Hunger becomes quieter, more physical, less emotional. Food thoughts loosen their grip, but emotionally, there's still a gap. This gap is where most people quit. They assume the flatness means something is wrong. They miss the stimulation. They crave intensity, not sweetness, but feeling. And because sugar used to deliver that feeling instantly, it becomes tempting again. But here's the key insight. What feels like emptiness is actually the space where regulation is returning. By days 8 to 10, dopamine receptors begin regaining sensitivity. This doesn't create excitement yet, but it reduces craving urgency. Sugar thoughts lose their emotional charge. They become suggestions instead of commands. At the same time, other reward pathways begin reactivating. Physical movement feels more satisfying. Completing tasks brings mild but stable pleasure. Sleep becomes deeper not because you're tired, but because cortisol rhythms normalize. This is the brain shifting from stimulation-based reward to stability-based reward. Around this point, many people report a subtle emotional change: less anxiety. Not dramatic calm, but fewer spikes, fewer racing thoughts, less internal noise. That's because blood sugar stability reduces stress hormone release. Cortisol no longer needs to compensate for crashes. Neuroscientifically, this is significant. Chronic sugar intake trains the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, to stay reactive. Each glucose spike followed by a drop is interpreted as instability. Over time, the brain becomes hypervigilant. Removing sugar allows that system to stand down. By days 11 to 14, this calming effect becomes noticeable. Mood steadies, emotional reactions slow. You respond instead of react. Focus stretches longer. Tasks feel less overwhelming. Not euphoric, but manageable. Sustainable. This is the point where people often say, "I feel more like myself," end quote. But in reality, it's something more precise. You're experiencing your nervous system without constant artificial interference. The brain is not excited yet. It is regulated. And regulation, unlike stimulation, is quiet. This stage doesn't feel dramatic enough to be celebrated. There are no fireworks, no sudden clarity. That comes later. But what's happening here is foundational. The brain is reestablishing trust in its environment. Energy supply is predictable. Reward is proportional. Signals make sense again. In other words, the nervous system is learning safety. And once the brain senses safety, it becomes willing to release control. That's when the real transformation begins. Around day 15, the shift becomes unmistakable. Not dramatic, but decisive. This is the point where the brain stops negotiating and starts rebuilding. Up until now, your nervous system has been stabilizing. Dopamine receptors have been recovering sensitivity. Stress hormones have quieted. Blood sugar signals have smoothed out. But something deeper begins here: rewiring. Neural pathways that once revolved around sugar anticipation, reward, relief, start to weaken from lack of use. At the same time, new pathways strengthen. Ones associated with sustained attention, with effort followed by satisfaction, with rest that actually restores instead of sedates. This process is called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change its structure based on experience. And it's not abstract. Brain imaging studies show measurable changes during this phase, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and long-term planning. Chronic sugar intake dulls its influence by constantly hijacking attention with short-term reward. But when sugar is removed long enough, this region regains authority. In practical terms, this is when willpower feels less strained. Not because you're forcing discipline, but because fewer impulses are competing for control. You begin to notice it in small moments. You pass a dessert without internal debate. You delay gratification without tension. You choose food based on how it makes you feel later, not how it hits you now. These are not personality changes. They are neurological ones. At the same time, a metabolic shift completes itself. By the third week, many brains begin running on a more consistent mix of glucose and ketones. Ketones are molecules produced when fat is used for energy. Unlike glucose spikes, ketones provide steady fuel, and the brain responds well to that stability. People often describe this phase as clear, light, or quiet. Thoughts connect more easily. Memory retrieval improves. Focus stretches longer without effort. This is not mental sharpness created by stimulation. It's clarity created by the absence of noise. This is also where anxiety often drops noticeably. Sugar-driven blood sugar swings constantly activate the stress response. Each crash requires cortisol and adrenaline to compensate. Over time, this trains the nervous system to remain alert even when nothing is wrong. When sugar is removed, those swings stop. Cortisol rhythms normalize. The amygdala, the brain's threat center, reduces baseline activity. As a result, emotional reactions slow down. You don't stop feeling, you stop overreacting. Sleep also changes during this phase. Without sugar interfering with melatonin production, circadian rhythms realign. People fall asleep faster and wake up more rested, not because they slept longer, but because sleep quality improves. With better sleep comes better memory. High sugar intake has been shown to impair the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for learning and memory formation. Removing sugar reduces neuroinflammation, allowing neurons to communicate more efficiently. Synaptic plasticity increases. Information sticks. This is why, by the fourth week, tasks that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Cognitive load decreases. Multitasking becomes easier not because you're doing more, but because your brain is wasting less energy. Creativity often appears here as well. When the brain is no longer chasing quick reward, it regains space for exploration. Ideas link together. Insight emerges without force. This is the mental state many people associate with flow. And then comes the moment most people don't expect. After 30 days without sugar, reintroducing it often feels uncomfortable. The taste is overwhelming, artificial, almost aggressive. The brain, now sensitive again, reacts strongly to the dopamine surge. What once felt comforting now feels chaotic. This reaction reveals something important. The pleasure sugar provided was never true satisfaction. It was intensity. Once the brain learns stability, intensity loses its appeal. This doesn't mean temptation disappears forever. Memory remains, but the relationship changes. Sugar becomes optional instead of necessary. That's the real outcome of the 30-day process. Not restriction, not discipline, but autonomy. The brain no longer needs constant stimulation to feel okay. Energy becomes steady. Mood becomes predictable. Focus becomes reliable. And for the first time, many people realize how much mental fatigue they were carrying without noticing. It wasn't life exhausting them, it was instability. By the end of 30 days, you haven't just removed sugar, you've removed noise. And what remains is a nervous system that operates closer to its natural design. Science calls this adaptation, but experientially, it feels like control returning. Not control over food, but control over attention, emotion, and energy. And once the brain experiences that state, it rarely forgets it. So after 30 days, what actually changed? Not your personality, not your discipline, not your identity. What changed was the signal environment your brain was operating in. For years, sugar didn't just feed your body. It trained your nervous system to expect constant stimulation, rapid reward, and emotional compensation. And because that training happened gradually, most people never realized how much mental effort it was costing them. When you removed sugar long enough, the brain didn't become stronger through force. It became calmer through stability. Dopamine stopped spiking and crashing. Cortisol stopped compensating for chaos. Attention stopped being pulled in 10 directions at once. That's why the result doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like clarity. You didn't gain energy by adding something. You gained it by removing interference. And that's the part most health advice misses. This wasn't about willpower. It wasn't about restriction. It wasn't even about food. It was about allowing the brain to return to a rhythm it recognizes as safe. Once that happens, focus becomes natural. Mood becomes predictable. Cravings lose authority. And decisions feel quieter because fewer systems are competing inside your head. That's what real change looks like in biology. Not intensity, not extremes, but regulation. If this video helped you see sugar differently, not as a moral issue, but as a neurological one, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video if it added clarity. Subscribe if you want more science that explains how your body actually works in real life. And share it with someone who keeps blaming themselves for something that may not be a personal failure at all. And if you're curious how the brain responds to other forms of metabolic stress like fasting, walking, or sleep disruption, you'll find those breakdowns right here on our channel. Your body isn't broken. It's responding exactly as it was designed to. The moment you understand the signals, everything starts to make sense.